Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to be doing a step-by-step sewing tutorial of the Essex dress. So the Essex dress, I've recently updated it. So the original version has the little ruffle sleeve, but recently I've just decided to add a second version to the dress and add this longer puff sleeve. So I figured this was going to be a fun time to do a sewing tutorial. Then you can follow this tutorial to make your own. So the Essex dress is a pullover style. So there's no buttons or zippers, which I love. It has an elastic waist, which I'll show you. I like to put a belt sometimes right at the waist over the elastic, but you do have the 2 rows of elastic that runs, obviously all the way around. And then you have the gathered shoulder. It's just brought forward ever so slightly. The gathers, the V-neck, which I've recently brought up just a bit. The original was just about here. We brought it up about 1 inch for just a little bit more of a comfortable wear. I also have, with this version, I have increased the length by just about 1 inch. So it does fall right above your knee. It also has pockets, which are a must-have. This one I've just done a fun, this is a little lipstick print that I had scraps of that I decided to use in the pockets. So view A has the little flutter sleeve, which is finished with our bias tape. And then also the neckline is finished with a bias tape finish as well. And view B, of course, is the puff sleeve, which is just finished with a bit of elastic on the bottom. So the puff sleeves are really versatile because they're long. So this is just how they are, kind of comfortably below my elbow. But what I found is kind of fun to do because this elastic is actually quite stretchy and loose. I've actually found you can kind of play and make this one short puffy sleeves, a little bit longer, just like above the elbow. And I'm really excited because I think the puff sleeves kind of make this a more of a year-round dress as opposed to the flutter sleeve. When it comes to fabrics for the Essex dress, you have a ton of options. So I think really the Essex dress is beautiful and really shines in cotton poplin. So this that I'm wearing is just a solid color cotton poplin, but it's really fun to use some of these prints. So this is a beautiful cotton poplin by Dashwood Studio. This is my absolute favorite Essex dress I've ever made. This is a cotton poplin designed by my friend Cherie over at Whimsy Kaleidoscope. This is one of her signature prints. I also have this version in a lightweight chambray that I did. I also did a color blocked version, which you might have already seen on my channel. This was a bit of a hack, but really fun with the 3 colors. I love this Essex dress, and this again is just a 3 colors of solid cotton poplin. And all the way up to a heavier, like this is actually almost like a canvas type of fabric, which really gives it a lot of body in the little flutter sleeve. So on the other end of the spectrum, all the way to lightweight fabrics like a viscose challis makes a lovely, soft, kind of romantic Essex dress. So really, you can go anywhere from super lightweight, like viscose challis, silky type of fabrics, to your cotton poplins, your cotton broadcloth, even denim, chambray, all the way up to even heavier, like a like broadcloth for a more, pronounced kind of dramatic look. And it works really well with solids as well as your prints. So if you've ever been at the fabric store and admired some of those beautiful cotton poplin prints and wondered what would you make out of it, well, the Essex dress makes a really lovely dress for all of those beautiful prints. If you haven't already downloaded your Essex dress pattern, I will drop the link to my shop below. The Essex does run quite true to size, so be sure to check your body measurements in the instruction booklet, as well as the fabric requirements and notions as well, because you're gonna need some bias strips to finish the neck and the View A flutter sleeves. You're gonna need some elastic for your waistline, as well as for the sleeves if you're making View B. All right, ready to make your Essex dress? Let's get started. Let's start by cutting out our pieces. We're going to need 2 of the front cut on the fold, and just take extra care to make sure you place the fold on the correct edge. This is how your 2 front pieces will look, and we'll need 2 of the fronts. We'll need 1 of the back on the fold, 1 of the front skirt cut on the fold, 1 of the back skirt cut on the fold, 4 of our pocket bags. I'm using a contrasting fabric on mine. And then we'll need 2 of the back waistband cut on the fold and 2 of the front waistband cut on the fold. I'm using a contrasting fabric for my inner waistband. Then we're going to need a strip of 1-inch bias tape. For View B, we'll need to cut 2 of the puff sleeve, and for View A, we're going to cut 2 of the back sleeve and 2 of the front sleeve. Then we're gonna need our 3/4 inch wide elastic for the waist, and for View B, we're going to need just a bit of 1/4 inch elastic. To get started sewing, we're going to open out both of our front pieces and sew a line of gathering 5/8 inch from the top edge. Once you've sewn the gathering along both of your fronts, you want to place them right sides together, matching all of the cut edges. Then, using a ruler or just transferring the markings from the pattern, you want to draw in the stitching line in the center front V. Next, we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew right along that marked stitching line, making a pivot at the center front V. Next, you want to just trim right up close to that, the top of the V. Then I'm going to open out that seam and press the seam allowance open. I'll do this for both sides of that V. Then just match those 2 seams together, and then you have your front piece. You can continue pressing your front pieces right along the fold lines along the center front. Then we're just going to open out our front pieces again and just trim that seam from the point that we've just sewn down to about 1/8 inch, just to eliminate some of that excess bulk at the center front seams. Then we'll just match up the seams again, match up the cut edges of both of our fronts, and we'll set this piece aside. Next, I'm going to trim 3/8 inch away from the neck edge of my back piece. And this, you don't have to do this, but I find since we're using narrow bias tape, this actually makes it a little bit easier because we can use 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I take my 1-inch bias strip and I folded it in half and pressed it. Then I'm just pinning it along the back neck edge. Next, we'll take this to the sewing machine and attach it with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to understitch the seam allowance to our bias tape. So I'm just finger pressing my seam allowance over towards my bias tape. You can also take this to the iron and press it before you sew it, but I'm just finger pressing my seam allowance over to my bias tape and then just sewing a line of understitching on the side of my bias tape right along that seam. Then then I just take this to my ironing board and I've just pressed it to the wrong side. It folds over really nicely because we've done that understitching. Next, I'm just going to top stitch this down by sewing right next to the folded edge of my bias tape. It's just about 1/4 inch from the edge. Then we'll just give this a really good press. This is what it looks like from the right side, and then we'll set this aside. Next, I'm going to place a pin, or you can make a chalk marking, along the folded edge of the front, right at the shoulder. I'll do this on both sides of my front. Next, I'm going to open out one side of my front, and I'm going to place it with the right sides facing upwards. Then I'll place my one side of my back, right sides down, so right sides together, and I'm going to pull up the gathering stitches along the shoulder edge of the front until it's about the right size to fit along the back shoulder seam. Then I'll take the back neck edge and match it right up to the pin that we've just placed along the fold line along the front. And I'll just place a pin to hold this in place. So really that neck edge is just right up against the pin. Next, I'm going to match up the armhole side of my shoulder seam and place a pin. And then I'll just make sure that my gathering is fitting perfectly along the shoulder seam. And I'll just adjust those gathers so they're nice and even along the shoulder seam. Then I'm going to work on the other side of the front piece that we've opened out, pull up the gathering threads a bit, and then with right side of my front now matching to the wrong side of my back, I'm going to wrap it right around, matching up the arm side. And then right where we've placed our pin, I'm going to just fold over and keep it really nice and tight against my back. So you can see we've just sandwiched the back within the front, the two front pieces. I'm going to adjust the gathers so that they're nice and even on this side as well. And here's another view. You can see how our back piece is just sandwiched in between our two gathered fronts. Then I'm going to open out the other side of my front, pull up the gathers, match my back shoulder seam, match the back seam right up against my pin, and then adjust the gathers to fit. Pull up the gathers on the other side of the front, and then wrap that side of the front right around to the wrong side of my back, matching up the armhole side and wrapping the front nice and tightly around my back. Next, we'll sew through all 3 layers to sew our shoulder seams. Now we'll trim that seam just to about 1/4 inch. And you can turn your piece right side out, and ta-da, you have a finished neck edge. Next, we'll take this to the ironing board and just press those shoulder seams really well. And then we'll match front to back, right sides together at the side seams. And we'll sew each of the side seams You can finish this seam with either your overlocker or with the zigzag or an overlock stitch on your sewing machine. And you'll also want to press the seam towards the back. Then we'll set our front aside for now. So if you're following along with the written instructions, at this point in the video tutorial, I'm going to just go off of the written instructions just a bit because we are going to save our sleeves or the flutter sleeves for the very end. So at this point, we are going to continue on finishing the lower half of our dress, and then at the end, you'll skip ahead to either view A sleeves or view B sleeves, and we'll put those in at the very end. So we're gonna achieve the same thing, just a little bit out of order. Now we're going to attach our pockets to our skirt. So I like to start by first overlocking the outer edge of each of my 4 individual pocket bags. Then I'm going to just pin my pocket bags to the front and back of my skirt along the markings, right sides together. We'll do all 4 of them. Then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew right along the pocket edge using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to take this to my overlocker and I'm going to overlock the entire side seam of my front and back skirts. So each of the 4 side seams, I'm going to just finish those raw edges. You can use your zigzag on your sewing machine as well if you don't have an overlocker. Next, I'm going to first press my pocket flat, and then I'm going to press the pocket away from my skirt right along that seam that we just sewed. Next, I'll match my front skirt to my back skirt, right sides together, and I'm going to just pin those side seams, pin the pocket bag together, matching up all of the edges. Then we're going to sew, making a pivot around each of the corners of the pocket. We'll sew this with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, we're going to press both of our side seams towards the front. So pressing the entire seam as well as the pocket bag towards the front of our skirt. Now we have both our top and our skirt pieces finished. Now let's work on the waistband. So I'm going to match my front and back waistband right sides together, and I'm going to sew the side seams. Then I'll press that side seam open and I'm just going to trim the seam allowances to about 1/8 of an inch or so just to get rid of the bulk. Then I'll take my top piece and I'm going to match my waistband to the top, matching up the side seams. Once I have the side seams pinned in place, then I just place a couple more pins at the center front and the center back just through all the layers. Then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. We're going to sew this entire seam in a round to attach the waistband to the front. So now this is what our piece looks like at the moment. So now what we're going to do is take our skirt and match it right sides together along the lower edge of that waistband with the top edge of our skirt. We're going to start by just matching up the side seams first. really getting those side seams matched up perfectly. And then once we have the side seams pinned, we can just place another couple pins at the center front and right around the center back. Then we're going to take this to our sewing machine and sew the entire seam in around. This is what it looks like once we've sewn that seam. This is what it looks like from the wrong side of our garment. We're going to set this aside, and now we're going to work on our inner waistband. So I'm using a contrasting fabric. We're going to sew one of the side seams normally, and one of the side seams we're going to sew like this. We're just going to sew in 5/8 of an inch from each of the raw edges, creating a little opening where eventually we're going to feed our elastic through on the waistband. So then I can just press both of these seams open, and on the normal side of the side seam here, I'm just going to trim that seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch or so. Then we're going to finish one raw length edge of our waistband. I'm overlocking mine, but you can also fold under 1/2 of an inch, or you could zigzag yours. Next, I'm going to take my dress piece and I'm going to fold the skirt inwards. So I'm working from the wrong side, just folding that skirt in so I can get to that first seam where we sewed the waistband, outer waistband, to our top. Then I'm going to take my inner waistband with the right side of my waistband to the wrong side of my top. And I'm going to match up the side seams first, very much similar to what we did with our outer waistband. Match up the side seams. Once we have the side seams pinned into place, then I can place a couple pins just around the center front and around the center back. And then we'll sew the seam in around, just like we did with the outer waistband. So once we sew that seam, this is what it looks like. And at this point, we've done no ironing of these seams. So now we're going to do a lot of ironing. Let's take this to the ironing board, and we're going to press these waistband seams up or down towards the waistband. So we'll press that lower waistband seam upwards and the upper waistband seam downwards. So we'll just press that lower waistband seam upwards, and then pressing from the inner waistband, just pressing that down over our seam. So this is what it looks like once it's all pressed. We've got a lot of bulk in here. We've got a lot of seams. So let's grade these seams to reduce some of that bulk. We're going to do that by, I'm first just folding my dress inwards again. I'm working from the inner waistband, trimming it to about 1/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to trim my top to just about 1/4 of an inch. I'll do that all the way around this waistband seam. And then we can work on the lower waistband seam. So here I'm just cutting my outer waistband seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch, and the skirt seam allowance there to about 1/4 of an inch. And I'll do that all the way around my waistband seam. And then from there, you can start to see how that inner waistband is going to fold right over. And now this is starting to create our casing. So I'm working now from the wrong side of my garment, and I'm just going to start pinning. I'll probably put 2 or 3 pins just to hold this waistband downwards in place. Nice and smooth. Then I'm going to turn my dress right side out, and now we're gonna put some more pins in this just to really hold this down. So working from now the right side of my garment, I'm just kind of putting my arm through the top, and I can feel the waistband underneath. And now I'm going to put pins right where my waistband meets the skirt. So I'm just going to really pin through all the layers, catching the inner waistband with my pins, and really just getting this pinned in really well, because this is where we're going to next stitch in the ditch to attach the inner waistband down and create our casing. Once I've got all my pins in place on the outside, I can just go back and take out those pins that I placed on the inside of my garment, because we don't need those anymore. All right, now we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch in the ditch to secure this waistband to our garment. So I have actually turned my dress wrong side out so that I can work from the right side of my garment. So I'm starting at the side seam, and I'm just going to double check that my inner waistband is nice and flat, and we are going to just stitch in the ditch right in that area where the waistband meets the skirt. I'm sewing through all the layers so that I'm catching the inner waistband as I sew. Once I have my stitching in the ditch complete, now we're going to sew another line of stitching right down the center of our waistband through both of the layers. So through our outer waistband and our inner waistband. So I just take my tape measure here and I'm just kind of eyeballing my halfway point using my tape measure as a guide. You could also mark this with chalk or with pens or with an erasable marking pen, however you'd like to do it. Now we just have two casings, and that's where we're going to now insert our elastic through that little hole we created on the side seam of our inner waistband. So now I've cut two pieces of my elastic, roughly the length of my true waist, plus several inches just for to give me extra room to attach the edges and all. So I'm using a large safety pin. That is the secret with doing this waistband, is use a large safety pin. It's gonna make things so much easier to do. And I just feed my first piece of elastic through one of the casings. And it does get a little bit twisted at some points. I don't really worry about the twisting until I have both of my elastics in through the casing. So I just am placing a safety pin here to secure the edges so I can kind of work with my elastic and pull it and get it all situated evenly. So I kind of get that first elastic going and get it nice and flat. And then I do my second row of elastic the exact same way. So once I have both of my rows of elastic kind of flattened, evenly placed, it does take a little bit of massaging, literally, your elastics, but I just make sure that I don't have any twists in there. I actually at this point try on my garment just to make sure that the elastic is tight enough. So once I have it adjusted to the length that I'd like it, I'm just overlapping the edges so it's nice and flat, and then I'm sewing a box around to secure the ends of my elastic. So I'm pivoting at each of the corners and backstitching, just sewing a really secure seam. And that is our waistband. So this is what it looks like from the inside. If you're making the puff sleeve version, you can just keep following along. We're going to finish this sleeve If you're making the little Flutter sleeve version, you want to skip ahead just one chapter. I will have the chapters marked below, so just skip ahead to the next chapter for the Flutter sleeve. Now for our puff sleeves, we're going to start by sewing 2 lines of gathering at 6/8 of an inch and 4/8 of an inch between the notches on the top cap of our sleeves. Then we're going to place right sides together and sew the side seam of our sleeves. I finished off my seam with my overlocker and pressed it to one side. Then we're going to place our sleeve inside the armhole of our dress, matching first the underarm seams, and then matching the notch at the very top of our sleeve to the notch on our garment, and then matching the side seam or the side notches as well. And then I can pull up the 2 lines of gathering to fit my armhole. I like sewing the lines of gathering at 6/8 of an inch and 4/8 of an inch because what it does is create a nice neat channel for me to sew at 5/8 of an inch. And then once we're done sewing this on, we'll just remove the gathering threads, and then we have a really, really nice, neat puff sleeve. So once I have my sleeve all pinned in and the gathers evenly spaced, then we're going to take this to the sewing machine and sew this seam at 5/8 of an inch. This is so easy to sew when we've done the gathering this way. We have that nice, neat channel to sew right over all those gathers. Just making sure all those gathers are nice and even. One last check. Once my seams are sewn, then I just finish the edges with my overlock. You could definitely zigzag those as well. Now, moving on to the lower hem of our sleeve, I've gone ahead and just finished the bottom raw edge of my sleeve, and I've pressed up about 1/2 of an inch on that lower edge. Now I'm going to just make a casing, so I'll sew along the lower edge, just leaving a little bit of an opening for my elastic to go through. I've cut my 2 pieces of elastic, just slightly larger than my arm, and I'm going to use a safety pin and just feed that elastic through that casing we created on the lower edge of the sleeve. I usually try on my garment just to make sure that I have the sleeve elastic to the perfect adjustment. Once you have that, then you just want to overlap those ends of the elastic and sew a nice strong seam there to secure our elastic in place. And finally, we'll just sew up that last little opening in our casing. So I just go back through and continue my stitching line along that lower edge of the casing there. And now our sleeve is complete. It looks so good. The last thing we need to do is finish the hem of our dress. So I've gone ahead and just finished the raw edge of my hem, and I folded up about 2.5 inch. I'm going to finish this with a machine blind hem. You could also do a top stitch. All right, so now we're gonna do the Flutter sleeve version. Okay, so I'm going to start by taking my front sleeve and my back sleeve, and also preparing my 1-inch strips of bias tape, sewing them into one long strip and pressing it in half lengthwise. Then I'll match each of my sleeves right sides together, and I'll sew both of the seams to make this into a round. I'll overlock or just finish the raw edges and press them to one side. So once we have our sleeves sewn into a circle, we're going to attach the bias tape to finish the raw edges. So I started the lower edge of my sleeve, that's the skinnier end of the Flutter sleeve, and I'm just matching my bias tape right along the raw edge, just going along the edge and pinning my bias tape in place. Now I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and sew this on with 1/4 inch. Once I get to the end of my binding, on one of the ends, I just finger press under about 1/4 inch. You could also press this under as well, but I press under the raw edge and then kind of lay it along the seam line. And then the other end of my binding, I just slide right inside of the other end that's finished off. And then I just continue sewing on my binding at the 1/4 inch, just sewing right over that area where I've connected them, just as if it's one piece of the bias tape there. And then this is how it looks once I've sewn it on. Next, I'm just going to grade this seam allowance down by cutting my bias tape to about 1/8 inch and my sleeve seam allowance to about just under 1/4 inch. Really, just a scant 1/4 inch, just to grade out some of the bulk here. Once we've got that done, I finger press my seam allowance towards my bias tape, and we're going to understitch the seam allowance to our bias tape. You could also give this a press at your ironing board just to make it a little bit more neat. I just finger press it here, and it kind of just naturally falls really nicely. So we'll just continue understitching our bias tape. This is how it looks once we're finished with this step. We're going to then fold our bias tape to the wrong side of our sleeve along that seam line, and we're going to top stitch along the outer folded edge of our bias tape. So just about 1/4 inch from the folded seam line there. Then we're going to give our sleeves a really good press all along the entire Flutter sleeve. And next we're going to attach our sleeve to our garment by placing the sleeve right sides together in our armhole, matching the lower seams and the notches, and then you can finish that seam with an overlocker or bias binding if you'd like. So that is the Essex dress. So I would love to see what you make. Please tag me and share your Essex dress over on Instagram at Sewing and the City. I'd really love to see what you make and share it with the rest of the community. And if you have any questions or need a little bit of extra help with the sewing of your Essex dress, feel free to reach out to me at hello@sewingandthecity.com, and I'm happy to help you through. All right, I think that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. All right, bye.